It's funny you talk about dust. I think of how many quarterly reports and annual reports I see where they've got a picture of the drill rig lined up in this massive plume of dust, or they're sampling the bags on the ground and they've got all the piles next to each other and bleeding into each other. But no, there was a teaspoon of dust at the lab. How dare you contaminate our samples? So I remember at a conference seeing someone having a video and I went up to them and I said, what's going on with that sampling technique? That doesn't look like best practice. But you're right, when it comes into the lab, people focus on the things that they're familiar with, and so that's right. And I think to your question of what should they be focusing on, they should be focusing on things like the splitting processes, because we're taking a split and we assume that it's representative. The number of people who'll coarse crush drill core to 6 mil and then riffle split it is phenomenal. And the bias that's introduced there, because you're only controlling for 2 parameters, is huge. Similarly, subsequent splitting, pulverizing, absolutely there is going to be carryover in pulverizing. Understand your geology and think about how would you control for that. Put in flushes. Get to know what your lab does when they pulverize. That's the one thing. People go, I put a blank in after the high grade and it didn't pick up anything. It's like, well, we don't pulverize sequentially. We have to use 3 mils. So have a conversation. And I think the biggest takeaway is get familiar with your lab, because I sit back and I think the number of people who don't come for a visit or an audit, but they're signing off on resources is very high. So it would be more than not.
Today I'm speaking with Ben Cooke, who is the Regional Service Manager at Geochemistry at ALS. Now, obviously I'm not having this discussion in this studio because he is in Perth, but I happened to be in Perth last week where we recorded this. So it was an in-person conversation, and there's a bit of noise in the background because it was an active office, because we had our 15-year anniversary, which was a lot of fun as well. But so it's a little bit messy, but we had a fantastic conversation. I've been wanting to speak with Ben for such a long time. Ben and I have worked together on and off for 18, 19 years on a whole bunch of projects. And he's always so transparent and happy to share information about how things work at a laboratory. So I learned a lot from Ben. And he's always been really open. So I asked him a whole bunch of questions and myths about the lab, stuff about what should people ask when they, get a quote from a lab, or how do they deal with big quotes, small quotes, what quality guarantees do they want to provide, how do they deal with resubmissions and all those wonderful things that you hopefully always wanted to know, or at least I wanted to know these things. So I asked him a few point-blank questions, and it's been a really interesting discussion. Hope you get something out of it as well. Let's get into it.
Ben, thanks for making the time, man.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, pleasure. It's been a long time coming.
It's been a long time coming. We've been trying to get this on the road for a while, but you travel a bit, I travel a bit, and so on.
Yeah.
So.
Ducks don't always align.
Yeah. I was actually, when I sent you the email, I was like, I hope we actually...
Yes, I hadn't pulled out or something at the
moment. Well, not that, but it's good.
Yeah.
Exciting to have this conversation, because actually, we've been talking for years.
Yes.
I mean, and maybe before we start, I interviewed a lot of geologists and mining engineers, but you're neither of those two. So.
No, I'm outside of that.
Outside of that. So tell us, what's the trajectory?
So I'm currently, I guess, a regional services manager for ALS, which is a title that covers a few different hats. But I started off close to 25 years ago now with that company. So I've been a bit of I think they call that a lifer at some point. So
must be doing something, right?
Yeah, well, that's what they keep telling me. But started off on a 3-month contract doing data calculations after faxing my resume in to get the job, and was given the job. And after another 3 months, I was still there. And one thing led to another, and that was around, I guess it was 99. And
was it in Perth as well?
No, that was in Brisbane. So I started in Brisbane, and gold was sort of $300 an ounce, and noticed my colleagues were disappearing, not coming back to work the next week, kind of thing. And so got the opportunity to learn to do a bit more work in the lab, which led to just being more dispensable. And when the crunch really came there, I guess in 2000, 2001, I was last man standing, and sort of knew how to do everything. And then things turn as they do in this industry with its cyclical nature and all that. And so I turned to focused on sort of a production role, and then we rolled out a global LIMS through the acquisition of the Chemex group as part of ALS, and then through that time got to travel a bit to various sites and sort of learn their processes while we put our processes and standardise things. And moved to Perth in 2006 to take up a role as a geochem section supervisor, and sort of ran that section for about 2 years, sort of just focusing on the digestion side of things and AAS, so sort of cut my teeth in a lot of processes there.
Right.
Then moved into, again, production and assistant manager role. Did some BD for a little while in Indonesia.
Wow.
As a bit of a diversion.
Okay.
And then came back as client services manager for the Perth lab, which is sort of had become one of our bigger facilities in the world.
Yeah.
And then have taken over sort of roles there to various things, and to BD and client services for the group in Australasia. So
Jeez, from all grounds, really.
Well, that's it. I mean, people say, 25 years, it's a long time, and it is, but I've been lucky to
different things.
Well, that's it. I haven't done the same thing for more than a couple of years, and I think that's where starting with a company that had 500 employees when I started to 18,000 now, growth cycle gives you opportunities. You can say yes to things.
But you've also, I mean, and again, just cutting in at some line here, but you've also obviously seen so many new changes coming into the industry.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
So, I mean, and then just to start there, I mean, what?
Well, I mean, in the first roles I had, we were doing calculations of ICP data in Excel using macros that were programmed by one guy who was the Excel guy. Yeah. We were still printing A3 worksheets on blue and white tractor feed paper. Awesome. And certificates were hand signed by the laboratory manager.
You've put those on the wall?
Yeah, well, that's right. There's still a few of them floating around there. So, there'd be a run every week for the lab manager to do all of his signatures so we could mail out the certificates of analysis. Yeah. And that was only 24 years ago.
Wow.
Well, actually, we were still doing it 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's unbelievable.
It is, and faxing results out for high priority results. So, it's changed a little bit. Some people still get their printed certificates because they don't have an email address in 2023, which is
okay.
which is funny.
Name and shame. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's right. We'll leave that to later.
I'll leave that.
But even then, from a process perspective, the first ICP that I saw was the size of a small bus, and could probably do a few elements here and there, and we were still doing press powder XRF, which was the go-to method when I first started in there, and to now an ICP is smaller than an AA in some respects, and so the miniaturization and the speed and the sensitivity of those things have probably been the biggest changes in a lot of the benchtop instrumentation that we do.
Interesting, because I mean we often get called out for not being innovative enough and all these things. But 20 years to see all of that changing, that's pretty cool.
Well, that's it. And I think even things like detection limits on mass spec data and sensitivity of techniques, and being able to detect things below what was previously a barrier crustal abundance and that sort of stuff have been big innovations. I think. If we go back to, again, when I first started, a lot of, ICP only work. Mass spec was sort of, if you were rich, it was a luxury that you would get mass spec data. Gold would be done by AA with an organic solvent extraction and all those sorts of things. Whereas now, an aqua regia through gold can do, or cyanide leach through gold can do parts per trillion detection things, And so that, and of course the lowest detection limit isn't always the end of it, but it's about what does that give you and what's the precision you can get from that.
Exactly. And there was, has the demand changed? I mean, people obviously want lower detections and they want faster and more. And, the industry has changed, the equipment has changed.
Yeah.
Have the clients changed in their demands, or?
Yeah, I think in my perception of it, there's been a demonstrable change in the last 10 years, and I think it's driven in part by the change in the ore bodies in Australia that we're assessing. So, in the first 15 years of my career, you would assay for gold, and the best pathfinder for gold was gold. But you were drilling in the first 100 metres of cover. You weren't worried about transitional metals. You weren't worried about sulfides unless you were hitting basement. So you might do, if you had an advanced project, you might do arsenic and sulfur and maybe iron, but you'd still do gold. And if you didn't have gold, you didn't care that you didn't have gold. But now that we're being more sophisticated, we're going to depth, we're going to more complex ore bodies. People realise that you can't just rely on gold. And to find them at surface, you also can't just rely on gold. And that's been the biggest change.
Yeah, and we see that as well, right? I mean, we used to build models for clients just on gold grades, and then try and somehow say that has something to do with geology. But now to have all those different elements and for that to roll out of the instrument so quickly is and at a good cost and a low cost.
Well, that's it. If you look at the assay cost as a function of a drilling program, it's probably less than 10% of the overall cost, and so. And the multi-element suites that are available now and the sensitivities to fortify them, it seems like it's a waste to not do it, on the data. You've already gone to that effort. So why would you not do it? And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but yes.
But do you see that change? I memean, you talk obviously in your role in BD as well. I mean, you talk to clients. The pressures change, or the pressure point, is it still turnaround time? Is that changed?
Well, turnaround time is still a function of what people demand, unless things are busy. And then people, particularly with COVID, people just accepted that we had no wiggle room with that. We could only do so much because of border closures, because of supply chains, because of staff. And so then the value proposition becomes, what am I getting for the value of this data? And to your point before about modelling up, the geomet applications now that come from multi-element data and the things that you can do with hyperspectral, multi-element, and PXRF, and some of these other sorts of things.
It's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool, but it's almost become, it has to be done. You can no longer just walk up with an ore body and say, well, I've got this many ounces of this many tons, because the upshot of that is how are you going to actually process it, and what's that going to mean in 2 and 3 and year 4, and how do you do that? So I think the sophisticated explorers, certainly the big end of town, multi-element broad suites with as many collecting data along the way as they can. Juniors still fall into 2 camps. Either the cheapest possible way to get a binary answer.
Well, I was going to go there, because what I'm always interested in is point of difference, right?
Yes.
I mean, we run a service company, and point of difference is just fundamental.
Yes.
If you're a laboratory, a lot of the clients that you work with, especially the smaller end of town, don't really kind of understand the nuance in the quality, I guess.
No.
Because quality is everything. Turnaround isn't the biggest thing there. So how do you educate them? And that fire assay, I know how much that 10 cents, makes a lot of difference at that point in time. If you're talking hundreds of thousands of samples.
Yes.
How do you, when you write these proposals for clients, when you put your quotes together, what's in your head as you're dealing with, ABC exploration that's just picked up a $2 million project? How do you tackle these things?
Well, it's a few things. I think it's, you've got to look at who's behind the company. That's one of them, because you get to know the characters, and the industry is small enough to know that some people have a preference one way or the other. Secondary to that, though, is to understand, the area that they're working in. Where are they working, and what have people that we already do work for done that's been successful, or that hasn't been successful, or maybe they've struggled with. And then the third part is, what type of explorer are they? What are they actually aiming to achieve, and what's their budget at this point in time? Because, if they're a junior that's just raised $2 million to spend it on this project versus someone who's just listed with $10 million in the bank, they're likely to have an appetite to do things differently. And it really depends on, are they going to be pressured to get results to market in the next 12 months? Because, that will change the dynamic of what they're looking for.
So are you getting them into the office to have this conversation, or how do you approach it?
It's over the phone. It's conferences. It's people coming in for a chat. It's all any combination of those sorts of things. It's really just because some people like to have Teams meetings these days. Prior to the pandemic, of course, that would have never been the case. But it's a combination of those sorts of things. Because for me, when I look at it as a service provider, we're going to get the best value out of long-term repeatable work with clients, and our clients are going to get the best value out of what we do by getting data that's useful. So there's no point just saying, oh yeah, mate, just do a fire assay because that's what everyone else does, because that doesn't differentiate us either as a service provider.
Well, that's difficult because we have the same conundrum. Do you give the client what they ask for, or do you give them what they need? And how do you tackle that one when the first phone call is happening? Right? So particularly you take gold as an example, right? I mean, most people, Photon Assay, everybody's talking about it. I'm sure we'll cover that at some point. But what do people need? It needs to be fit for their purpose.
Well,
right? Photon Assay on an exploration project is pointless at a 0.3 sort of detection limit.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's to take a step back, I guess, and say, well, if a good example is, okay, are they doing 4 metre comps, or are they doing 1 metre comps, or are they, they sampling every sample, or are they at the drill core stage? Because each of those would have a different approach for them. Doing a 4 metre comp, well, They want a binary answer. They want, is there or is there not gold? Because if there is, they'll go back and do the 1 meters anyway, and they'll do a more comprehensive technique and maybe, fit for purpose. If they're at surface and they're soils, well, an aqua regia suite, and maybe they just, again, want gold only as a sniffer and they don't want the multi-element. We know the multi-element's going to tell them more, but there is a cost differential in that. And so it's a trade-off of putting forward the options, and I like storytelling. I like to be able to say, well, look, I've quoted this, but you might consider this, and here's why you might consider that. And it's not a case of, this is the only thing I'm quoting, because, I've got to be mindful that if they're getting, 2 or 3 quotes from other providers, the other providers are going to probably put forward a different narrative. And so I've got to make sure that I control the narrative that's right for us, because, there's probably a percentage of the market that don't value you as what you can bring that's outside of here's the transaction of the assay. And so... And you may never win them over, and that's okay.
Well, for some people, it's just bottom line.
Yes, right? It's almost commoditized for some people.
Yeah, and you probably need to recognize that earlier on to make sure that you get the best balance there.
Well, and they're often the ones that don't pay their bills on time anyway.
Well, and I mean, the other thing is, and I'm not sure how you're dealing with this, but, you probably quote based on numbers as well, right? I mean, if you get somebody for...
It's a volume-based
It's a volume-based thing. And... they might plan for 10,000 meters of drilling, right? And that might be the carrot.
That's always the case.
And then after 2,000 meters, decisions get made, and you got that cheap fire assay price. I mean, is that still something you...
Look, in a commercial laboratory basis, it's less of a concern because our efficiencies come from having work that's consistent and the same methodologies. So, but the reason we can offer a price for a volume-based work is that there's a larger volume of work. It's consistent, and if we know day in, day out that we've got the work there, it's efficient for us. Where it becomes a challenge is where we've got samples this week and then nothing next week. We've still got people to pay for and so do we just stand them down for a week and then they're not there the following week. So it's less about someone not saying, oh, well, I only did this and I'm going to do this, and they do that. We might consider that when we re-quote them next year. And whether they're truly going to do that sort of work, and that might affect what we can do in that regard.
I mean, I'm always hearing from clients as well. I mean, there seems to be quite a lot of loyalty as well. I mean, once you're with that one group, you kind of tend to stick with them. I mean, we've been working together for a while. And
that's true. That's true. I think geologists, and not to generalise, they're a superstitious bunch to some extent, but they don't like change.
That's for sure.
And I think when it comes to their assays, a lot of them, they don't want to have to think about their assays. They want the certainty that what they're getting is fit for purpose, and so. If nothing is going wrong and the person's not coming back every year and saying, hey, give us another 50% on top of this sort of thing, they're reticent to change unless there's a compelling reason to change. And again, there's a subset of people who every year shop around, find the person who's willing to give them an extra 5 cents and they'll go and use them.
But I don't think there'd be many of those.
I don't think so. Right? No, and I think it's becoming more, people are attaching themselves to the value that they're getting.
Well, and the trusting, right? Because I really want to lift that one out. For us, it's trust as well. Once people know that you're not just clocking hours for the sake of it, and they actually know that you're working in their best interest and trying to get the best out of the product. That's valuable, right? And the same with, and I want to dive into that a little bit deeper, and let me know when I trail off too much in territories that might become tricky. But
that's fine.
I think I want to link that trust to quality, right? Because that's what I mean. That you can do the numbers and the turnaround time. That's one mechanical part of it,
of course,
right? And I don't really play in that game because I don't have an announcement to make.
No.
So, but I do want to trust that the data are of good quality. And that's not, as I would like to at some point get into a bit as well, that's not easy. It's not a line to the right and with a tick and so on.
No,
so you need to really have that transparency, right? And I've talked about it with you before. That transparency is quite important. How do you generate that? I mean, because you've always been quite transparent at things that don't go right, and sometimes that happens, right? Even at the best labs. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I think that transparency is the thing that you touch on is the important part. I remember years ago, probably 15 years ago, when we brought in our WebTree system, we had what we called the Open Lab Initiative, which is, it's a bit of branding, but it really was a doctrine for how we operate. And so the data are available. You can see an audit trail. You can see results as they appear. You can see where we've reweighed things. We give all that information, and that's really around to show that it's a process. I was racing here this morning from a lab tour, and people could say, "Oh, why are you doing a lab tour?" And that's the single most important part of what we do in some respects, because it gives context to the fact that the number that we're providing isn't a fixed point. And that's what part of that lab tour I say to people: every result is wrong. It's just a matter of how wrong it is. And whether that's important to what you do with it.
So going into that lab tour a little more, because I'm fascinated by those, right? I mean, I've done the lab tours at the stuff, and there's a difference between a tour and an audit.
Absolutely, yes.
Obviously, right? The tour is the photo taking geologist that roams around the laboratory. Here's the prep
taking
station.
a video of the auto sampler or fire assay or something like that.
Cut and paste in the report, and
I definitely went to the lab.
I went to the lab, right? And just turning that a few questions, right? I mean, we have to, as resource professionals, we have to do these audits.
Absolutely.
And, our lab audits are quite deep, but it depends on the purpose, obviously, and depends on what you're trying to uncover. You're working with geologists, because they're probably usually geologists, not geochemists, probably haven't worked in a lab.
No, absolutely.
Right? So probably come to you with all the usual stuff about their standards and the usual stuff. But are they focusing, or are we focusing on the right things at the lab? If you would say, and you can't shoot yourself in the foot. But,
no, that's right.
But from a really healthy sort of, trust perspective, like, this is the stuff that matters.
Yes.
And for instance, I'll give you an example. I mean, the dust thing, right? Right, there's these RC bags, calico bags sitting there, and they're sitting on the tray, and the geologist comes in, and there's a little bit of dust, and it goes into a bowl, and people take picture, and big cross, dust, not a good lab, right? That sort of reasoning. And I'm guessing that's frustrating for you guys, because you can calculate that teaspoon of dust makes no difference on the gold grade whatsoever. Exactly. Taking that as an example, how do you deal with that when people come in? We're just letting it flow and see where it lands.
It's education, and we try to, in those processes. It's funny how often an audit will start out with a checkbook, ticking off things. And halfway through, they realise that what they've got there for the audit actually is irrelevant. And that what the conversation we're having about what we're doing is actually the more important part of the process. And it's funny you talk about dust. I think of how many quarterly reports and annual reports I see where they've got a picture of the drill rig lined up with this massive plume of dust, or they're sampling the bags on the ground, and they've got all the piles next to each other and bleeding into each other. But no, there was a teaspoon of dust at the lab. How dare you contaminate our samples? So I remember at a conference seeing someone having a video, and I went up to them. I said, "What's going on with that sampling technique? That doesn't look like best practice." But you're right. When it comes into the lab, people focus on the things that they're familiar with, and so that's right. And I think to your question of what should they be focusing on, they should be focusing on things like the splitting processes, because we're taking a split and we assume that it's representative. The number of people who'll coarse crush drill core to 6 mil and then riffle split it is phenomenal. And the bias that's introduced there, because you're only controlling for 2 parameters, is huge. Similarly, subsequent splitting, pulverizing, absolutely there is going to be carryover in pulverizing. Understand your geology and think about how would you control for that. Put in flushes. Get to know what your lab does when they pulverize. That's the one thing. People go, I put a blank in after the high grade and it didn't pick up anything. It's like, well, we don't pulverize sequentially. We have to use 3 mils. So have a conversation. And I think the biggest takeaway is get familiar with your lab, because I sit back and I think the number of people who don't come for a visit or an audit, but they're signing off on resources is very high. So, it would be more than not.
It would be, but there's an education process involved. And I don't know if you guys have something like this, but SGS has the Rocks to Minerals guide. And you have to ask for it. You can't just download it. It takes 6 months, but it's actually quite an informative document. It doesn't actually go through all the details, and I'm still thinking, why is it not possible to put a nice video together of particularly what happens on the fire assay from front to back, and just be clear about it so that people actually ask the right questions? I mean, favorite one, and you can kill this forever right now, but the benchtop rotary splitter.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And I'm sure you did, because the spoon is the other.
There's the other splitter.
That's the fun one, right?
Yeah,
everybody will know from somebody who's come around somewhere and wrote, that's not a good way to split.
Correct. Or we get the square scoop to take the split from the round pulverizer bowl.
And, those things, right? And we've gone to our one-day sampling course, so we know this is not good. So now you are bad because you're doing this, right? And it's fascinating, because the argument obviously is that materials is homogenized, either in the mill, and that the error introduced there is insignificant.
Yes.
But like you said before, how insignificant, you do need to tie it back to a purpose of some sort, and I'll come back to that. But the spoon thing, what do you tell? Because I've gone to labs where the managers were very unimpressed to have any discussions about any sampling errors.
Yes.
Right. And there are gradations of it. Because one thing that people do is they take the material out the mill, the pulverized material, and then they do the whole rubber, quartering, and then they take the brown paper bag, which is curved, right, and they scoop, and then I go like, well, that's probably not really good.
No.
Right?
No.
So there are gradations of this stuff.
Yes.
Can you shed any light on the micro rotary bench splitter? Because the sampling theorist and Jeff Lyman is obviously always saying you gotta use these sampling devices because they're only good ones. But then I've been to one lab and it's extra time. Yes. Because you have to put it in, press a button, wait, instead of just doing this. And every 3 seconds is another 20 cents on that fire assay. So,
and that's exactly the where it comes to. We can do anything with enough time and money.
Yeah.
And the reality of it is, in what is a production laboratory, we have to curtail the expectations of doing everything to absolute best practice. We do it to the best practices of our quality manuals and procedures, but they're fit for purpose of a production environment. And it's the story I talk about with fire assay is that most of our geochem techniques, we take a very small representative aliquot, we throw a bunch of acid on them and we heat them and we just overcome the sample. But to do that for fire assay, you think about if you're creating a bouillon from a concentrate, you put a bunch of concentrate in a big vat, you put in a boatload of flux, you wait for it to bubble up, you pour all the waste off, and then you get a gold bar at the end. To do that in a fire assay, you'd need sort of a pot about this big, and you could do maybe 100 samples a day. Well, that's not reality, and no one's going to pay for that as a commercial provider. And so the benchtop RSD would absolutely take a more representative split of the pulp, but at the cost of time and the cost of the analyses. And so I think, from a process perspective, what becomes better is being as consistent as you can with the process that you do, because if you're consistently using the same type of spoon, you're taking the same type of process, you're capturing a reliable aliquot on a calibrated balance, that's something that you're controlling for. And if you're controlling for as many as those critical control points, then the variation will be still measurable, and you'll be able to say, well, is this in control for the most part, or what was this? Why is this wildly wrong when we did everything else right?
Well, it's interesting that you use that word, because we, and might not go down that rabbit hole about the whole process control perspective.
I don't think we've got time to talk about control.
There is an in control part of that process, and then you can still say later whether you're actually happy with the data.
Yes.
Right? And as long as you're doing the same thing and you show that is consistent throughout the process, then you can still look at the variance later and decide whether that's acceptable to the purpose that you've created. So.
Well, that's it. And I think one thing that ALS does well and has a reputation for is its global consistency. We run the same limbs, the same quality manual, and the same methods wherever we operate. If you get a fire assay in Lima or you get one in Johannesburg, it's the same SOP with the same flux, with the same instrumentation, and there's no variation on that. And so the second part to that is around the critical control points, because within that process there are processes that, if something goes slightly wrong, it's not going to, it's wrong, but it's within that error that we ascribe to the methodology, that precision window. But there are critical control points. If the balance is dirty or the vessel is off to the side, well, that's going to be a wrong assay. If the fluxing is wrong and we end up with a lead button that's too small or too large, that is wrong.
It's special cause variation.
Yeah, that's it. And you can't come back from that. But if you've got something where, the lead button is just near the bottom of the threshold, ideally it would be a bit bigger. But probably 99 times out of 100, the assays are still going to be within the accepted tolerance for that method that is then ascribed to that result. So if you've got control of your critical control points and you have consistency, the rest tends to take care of itself. And that's not to say human error doesn't happen, because people are involved.
Absolutely right. But that's that's the normal course variation. That sits there. That's the noise in the system, and that's all fine. But like you said at the start, it is ultimately all just a cost benefit ratio. And if you're already making all these assumptions early, and you recognize that 30 gram is actually 0.4% of the drill core that you took.
Yes.
That is actually 0.005% of the actual volume of rock that you're testing.
Yeah.
And it becomes quite insignificant.
Well, the aha moment I use in fire assay is that I talk about the prills when you see them sitting in the QPAL, and I say, well, that prill there represents the 50 gram aliquot of the 300 gram pulp that we took from the 3 kilos of RC that you sent us that was from the 60 kilos you drilled. And we're going to tell you how much gold is in there, and you're going to use that to estimate 15 cubic meters of rock.
Good luck with that.
Best of luck to you. Now, we've got control of our part, but have you got control of the rest of the stuff?
Well, look, I know I teach this in the courses, right? I mean, the stuff that you introduce in terms of errors and variance at the front end is proportionally larger than what's happening at the lab. Doesn't mean you shouldn't look at that.
Well, how many people do their SGs at the last minute? And don't do any density work until they realise they've got to do a resource, and they don't know how dense their rocks are. And then they go out the back and float a bit of core and go, it's probably about 2.7.
Yeah, well, and then apply it to the average of the resource.
Yeah, exactly. To the millions of tons.
But the lab seems to be the easiest place to point fingers, because, and this is where I do want to drag in the CRMs without going into the control plots necessarily. But and I should be careful with. I'm going to get a lot of hate from people from studying these things, but I'm fascinated by them, right? Because I imagine, look, I've been part of so many site visits where the mine geology team have picked up a problem in the CRM, whatever that problem may be, right? And then something is wrong. They can't communicate with the lab. They can't work it out, but they've decided that that's where the reconciliation for the month is wrong. It's not, it's the lab, because that's standard. And you look at it and you go, look, it's a standard. So you should understand how the damn things are made and what's wrong with standards and all those sorts of things. But it must be difficult to sit there with a team of laboratory people on one side and another team. They both put standards in at different frequencies, at different rates, sometimes different standards, sometimes the same. And for there to be any logical positive outcome out of that discussion, it can only turn into a mismatch of noise, right? Is that what how do you guys internally, what's the secret handshake stuff going on after out of the room? You go, my God,
can you believe they did that?
Exactly. Well, what goes on there? Tell us all and solve this mystery.
What is the mystery? I think, CRMs are an important part of the quality process, but it is easy to become too focused on it, and especially focused on the value ascribed to by the manufacturer or the certifying body, because that value is an average of all the results that were determined at the time, but they were all methods that had their own inherent error on them. But we go, well, on this day, this was the result I got. So now that is our value. And, look, it's actually pretty tight. So this is our precision. But, if I go and do a AA finish instead of a gravimetric finish, for example, and even in the lab, if I do a volumetric finish instead of a weighted finish or weight for weight dilution, the inherent precision of that method is different, and my control around that CRM value is going to be tight. And so you can't get fixated on that particular value. To the point of, the geologists versus the labbies, we tend to come back to first principles and say, well, okay, if we're running a bunch of CRMs on our side and they're in control, then we presume that our process is in control. So then if the client standards are not under control, what are the factors that could impact that? Well, what's the matrix? Is it the same sort of material? Are we fluxing them slightly differently because they brown instead of grey? And when we looked at them, we found that they're going to require a different process. Are they a value or something different that maybe doesn't recover as well in that particular process, whether that's fire assay or aquaregia or something else? What first principles can we go back to understand why that variation there? And sometimes the amount of times I see people saying, we've got a low bias, and they show me a bin of data and it's a quarter of standard deviation below the mean. I have to chuckle, because I say, well, that's not really a low bias. You've got a nice controlled data set. Yes, it's below what the mean was. But what is that actually telling you as far as the performance of the laboratory? If I've got data like this and I'm supposed to be here, well, that's a problem. Because that's scatter, and that's
this is where So I do a bit of work in the space, as you do, but there's obviously, again, the difference between the process being in control in the first place.
Yes.
That has nothing to do with the actual certified value of that standard.
Correct.
If that process is in control, then you can then argue about the actual bias that you have. And it's either statistically significant or it is not.
Well, that's it.
And if it's a quarter standard deviation, depending on the variances of each of those data sets, it's either at an alpha of 5, it's statistically significant or not. And even that might not mean that the world needs to end, right?
Yes,
because then there is 5 other standards and they might not show that bias.
Well, that's the other things to look at. Yeah.
Right.
If you've only got one misbehaving standard and you've got 4 that are good and the lab's got 4 that are good.
So how do you guys, I really want to understand, because now obviously the next thing is resubmission, boom. You could do it again. And I'm sure you guys go, here's another one, let's just do them instead of having the conversation, right? I mean, you do your research, I get that.
Oh, absolutely.
You see if there's an actual issue, 100%, that's what you need to do. And then, if there's one standard off, do you go into the debate of, look, it's only one standard, don't worry about it, or you just do it?
It depends, because some people, of course, as you
like
can
a geologist.
Really. That's right. Yeah. I'll give you an estimate on it, but there's a few things to consider there, and I guess going back to the Open Lab Initiative, because we have all of our run data with our sequences and where they were. The first thing we'll look at is say, well, where did this fail standard fall within our own QC? And because we get the classic where someone's running a standard every 50 positions and they get a fail standard, and they're like, well, I want to run from the last fail standard to the next, the last passing standard to the next one. And we say, well, that's pointless, because these samples were processed on a Tuesday and your fail standard was processed on a Thursday. Unless there's something happening with space and time, they weren't impacted by those. So that's one of the things we look at. And there will be times where we'll still do a selection of reassays around the fail standard or within the run. And one of the things we do internally is if we've got, say, 2 standards, one of them fails, and it's, say, the high grade standard, well, we'll also have an imperative to reweigh the higher grade samples on that run to ensure that they weren't impacted by whatever happened to that standard.
Sure.
So that's a good approach to do for clients, as well as to look at, well, if everything's less than and my standard failed, your less than's not going to come back at 3 grams per tonne, more than likely. So let's look at, well, why are we reassaying it? What are we trying to answer from that question?
Well, that's it. What's the answer? And those reassays, I'm sure when you look at the numbers on the whole, 9 out of 10 times, there's no difference.
Almost, most of the time. Occasionally they do identify issues, and that's good, because we can investigate that and we can understand why this changed or why there was a demonstrable change.
And do you then still retrospectively see that in your own data? Because the one thing that I can't get my head around, I mean, specifically, we're talking big commercial lab now, not a small lab somewhere. Because that, again, right? I mean, you'd expect
you get the volume in the lab.
You guys insert, I don't know how many hundreds of these things during a day. And you're actually sitting on the chair watching the thing doing what it's doing. If that's not picking it up, I cannot understand how one CRM from one client can, with one bubble outside the stupid 3 standard deviation line, can suddenly miraculously pick up. I just don't get that.
And that's it. And that's random error versus systemic error.
Exactly.
And you will always get occasionally random error, but that's sort of what the beyond 3 standard deviations and going to 4 standard deviations.
It's just a rule.
It's just in a good healthy laboratory population of CRMs,
3 out of 1,000.
3 to 5 out of 1,000 should be outside of there, and they're okay. And if your control chart is all between 1, well, that lab is probably fudging.
No, look,
not that I'm casting aspersions.
No, but that's exactly right. I mean, I've seen that, right? I mean, as I keep talking about, I mean, I've seen people literally on CCTV smudge the CRMs in a small lab in a faraway place. And things needed to be done there, because I'm sure these things are limited KPI and so on. So
of course.
But it is. I mean, for us as consultants, also difficult to provide the advice, because quite often the stuff gets reviewed quite late, and then you have these difficult discussions, and it's all extra noise that nobody needs to.
Absolutely. And to your point before too about the values ascribed to these CRMs, we often see as part of our investigation is that the value that our method recovers is different to the nominal value, and that is a real thing. And we can actually see that for some of the manufacturers, they actually supply a data pack, and we can go back and we can see, well, ALS Vancouver, Perth, and ALS Lima, they all got results here. You ascribe this nominal there. But this is what our method, because a 4-acid digestion is not a 4-acid digestion is not a 4-acid digestion, except within one lab. Presumably, if they all run standardized systems like we do. And so you can't say that that's going to be the same. Similarly, in Aqua Regia, might be different depending on the parameters that you put into it.
And then there is within and between batch variants from the actual CRMs itself, right?
Yes.
These things need to be created as well. Then, it's...
One time in the back blocks of Mongolia, we had an issue with a standard, and it turned out the manufacturer had them labelled incorrectly.
Right.
And they were very similar grades.
Help. Yeah.
That was a really interesting investigation.
Errors, right?
And that's not throwing stones, because we're to all of us, but you can't just sit there and get back to that point about all results being wrong. It's easy to get fixated on, well, that's my number, and I have to hang my hat on that number, and it's never changing. Your number's shimmering on the horizon like a mirage, and you just need to know how big your mirage is.
So if I look in the camera and say, don't worry so much about your CRMs and leave your lab alone, would you be...
Oh, look, I think... Get to understand what your lab is doing. Go into your lab and see their processes. Get familiar with them. Understand what the processes are. And then, when you're looking at data, know what is actually wrong data that is screaming at you that there's a problem. But don't focus on a single point in time. If you've got 100 assays and one of them is a little bit out, sure, ask the question. A good lab will do an investigation. They'll log an incident. They'll do some check assays for you, and go through that process so that you can sign off and say, I looked at it. But don't be fixated on the fact that one data point invalidates your entire QC lot or your entire resources rule. Because it's bigger than that. And there's so many steps that got to that point.
I mean, and just going back to that, that fusion process and things that get going wrong, right? Because as a dumb geologist coming into this space, you try to read stuff, and I try to find pictures of this stuff that go wrong, but I can't find any of it.
No, we're very secretive there.
Very secretive. But there is this, I think you guys have a nice display in your office.
Yeah, we've got the Hall of Shame with different samples where geos try to trick us up with high-grade copper and...
exactly. But it's throw that in a few posts, I reckon.
Yeah, we probably could do that,
nice
actually.
Stuff.
Yeah,
I think...
And it's good for education.
Right, that's my
for
point.
Our staff in particular.
Because I talk about this stuff and said, what does it look like? Kind of draw it on the board, but it's not the same. So
no, and that's something we've used as a visual tool, and it's part of our tours where we just talk about how the quality process at the end of fire assay and throughout it is we're dealing with a reaction that has to be contained in an open vessel at 1,000 degrees with an unknown material. So in our other chemical reactions, we're throwing a bunch of acids into a very small aliquot, and we know it will be contained unless there's really weird stuff like carbon or other material. But with fire assay, we don't have that luxury. We have to use a certain amount of reagent to react with an unknown sample that has all these variabilities, and we have to get a perfect product at the end. So we as chemists have to adjust the recipe in our favour, whether that's adding other reagents, whether that's sometimes reducing the charge weight to change the amount of participants in that chemical reaction.
Do you inform your clients when you drop the charge weights? Because as a resource geologist, sometimes there's so much sulfur you go to 5 grams. I'd like to know about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we have hard limits on how low we'll go with a lot of those things as well. Like 5 gram assays should be very rarely done, and there should certainly be a discussion if they're being done routinely. That full metadata is available via our online systems, and we can report them. Usually we'll report them if we're cutting weights because of ongoing issues, and we'll have that conversation because people go, I need a 50 gram assay because that's industry best practice. But they're 10% sulfides with copper in them. Well, we will never be able to react that effectively to get a viable product. So we have to cut the weight. So you can save money and turnaround by doing it by a more effective method on the first pass or looking at alternatives. And so it's worth having a conversation. Again, get to know your product and know your laboratory.
And understand what's going on there. So, and that education space, I think there's definitely something to do there, because it'd be so nice to, even in these courses, just half an hour of this is what happens to your sample, just in the fascinating process about the fusion and then the accumulation, that is the reverse process. That never clicked in my head, until I actually went through the lab, it's like, wow, this is pretty clever actually, if you think about it. We're doing the same for 100 years, and maybe that's a good angle to just quickly dive into in the future and all these things. But how are you guys picking up the photon assay thing? And is that because I talked to the guys on this channel and they said we can't build them fast enough.
Yes. So no, there certainly seems to be a demand there. We've lucky we've got a couple of facilities that have them here in Australia through the acquisition of the Rene business a few years back, and it's finding its application in place like Kalgoorlie is a great example where you've got mature clients in brownfields operations who are drilling, large core samples to increase their sampling or decrease their sampling bias, increase their sampling efficacy. Sending them in and crushing them, they're often high grade, so trying to pulverize them is problematic because of smearing and carryover. So to be able to crush a sample, put it into to a jar, I mean, you've still got to be very good at your sample preparation. You have to split things. None of that changes.
Still difficult to do.
And you've got to have good control that the crushing is the right size, because that does affect the overall performance of the assay. The crystals guys will say that themselves. And so having good sample prep is really important. And then putting it through there for those higher grades, absolutely. Now, can you do that by fire assay? Of course you can. We've been doing it for a long time, and the labs that are doing that are geared up for that. But certainly that application is found to be a good one, because of the ability to crush, remove that need for the pulverizing step, and to get a larger sample reporting through to the instrument.
Yeah. And do you have a lot of clients that come in with an adjusted flow sheet based on their material? Because and they're out of fashion a bit, the sample nomograms and the heterogeneity test, because that was a good hype while it lasted.
I remember that well.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. And suddenly
people sending to me the HQ core in, wanting the whole thing pulverized and things like that.
Exactly. But it's regardless of whether the fundamental sampling variance formula is correct and what K and alpha and all these things actually are, the fundamental of lowering your actual material size and increasing the mass and the impact that has on your fundamental sampling error is relevant.
Yes.
So optimizing that process has relevance. So the standard 1 kg is 75 or 2 mil crush. I mean, how many people asking you to modify that, and how part of that dialogue are you at that point?
Yeah, I think there's still a gap there in knowledge, because I think some people, especially for new technology, they tend to lean into, the lab will guide me on what's best practice. And
they just tick the box, right?
Yeah, tick the box. Please
thing.
prep it and do the test, and that can be problematic, because there's a big difference between reducing or processing RC samples to split them out and put them into a container or to pulverize them versus core. You either need to do a 2-stage crush, or you need to do some other sort of process, and you need to be measuring the performance of that crushing, because you can't just assume that the fine crusher is staying the same the whole way through the day. You have to have good control of that, because if you put core into a crusher, it's going to move over time. So all of those good practices around sample preparation are still just so important. And
a lot of people doing that, because were we the only ones that asked for nested duplicates based on the original duplicates, or is there anybody actually asking for coarse crush duplicates and pulp repeats to be the same as the first split or the field duplicates?
Yeah, look, no.
Okay,
I think you were definitely ahead of the curve when that started. We do have people that want both a crush and a pulverizing duplicate on the same interval, and that we do see more of that, which I think is very good practice, rather than, I'll just give me 1 in 20, I don't care where it is. Well, that's a bit like the old way of doing umpires, where it's just like, I'll just send 1 in 20 off. But what if they're all less than?
The umpire's not. It breaks my. It's just, I don't know.
It's 5%. It's good. We're covering our
show me
in the box.
Which book has the 5% in it? I'll never find out.
Yeah, but no, the preparation side of things has become more sophisticated. Certainly, again, in the same time frame that multi-element data has become more of an imperative for people. Preparation. Sophistication has improved. If we go back to, years ago, we might have only had 1 or 2 fine crushers in the lab, and then now we might have 10 times as many of those, because people want samples crushed to a smaller size before they're split, which says that knowledge is out there. But often it's, we're pushing back saying, hey, I notice you've requested this. Is that
really
what do you really want here? Are you sure? I mean, we can do whatever you ask us, because we've got a subform, and that's that's sort of a binding contract in some ways. But again, it comes back to that. Well, we want our clients to get the best value out of the data, and so let's have a conversation before we're 1,000 samples into the program and you've got regret about what size we're splitting things at.
Yeah, well, it's just you're 1 in 20. It's silly if you're in gold, and 80% of that will be below detection if you're doing that random, and you're not really learning too much.
And that's where you hopefully can rely on your geology bit to know where your ore's likely to be, and then you do more of your intensive QA/QC in that part of it.
What we should be doing.
Absolutely. Let geologists be geologists. But I think I'd absolutely encourage people to do more in the way of those preparation duplicates and carry them through the process and analyse them and again understand processes. If they want to do blanks and flushes, don't do them just to catch out the lab, but do them in a way that you're actually measuring the process, because the blank is actually more useful to understand what your unknown samples are doing than just trying to catch out whether a process is clean or not.
Well, I think that is really interesting to me, because I think we're still doing stuff out of this trust thing. That's where it's coming from, or lack of trust thing, right? And it's the jork police, as I always call it. It's like that. And I've said this before, but I did receive a call asking me how much, what the ratio should be for jork.
Yes.
And, I mean, but as you just explained, you got to learn something from the material. And variance is the resource killer. So if you actually, through your sampling, and particularly duplicates, because those CRMs, and what these quartz flushes do trick the lab or understand where it's the duplicates and where the value really lies. Yeah. And if you get that right, I think you're learning a lot about your body.
Well, how much gold and resources is sitting in the other half of the core tray?
Yeah.
And how many people have actually done work of, well, if I only sample from the left-hand side, well, is that actually valid?
Oh, no,
or should I be doing?
Been done.
No, but how many people are applying it?
But hands down, that's
and so if you've decided that the 1 meter interval or a 2 meter interval of whole core is the best way to represent each sample in your ore body, well, then the lab can do that, but don't do it just because that's what you've always done. Because there is a time and a cost component to that. To crush and prepare a 6 kilo or 8 kilo sample versus a 2.5 kilo sample. Time, cost. So you could be putting that into a multi-element suite, for example, as opposed to just crushing a sample for that. You're actually not really achieving a better outcome from a sampling perspective.
Yeah, jeez. We can keep bearing down that rabbit hole.
Absolutely.
What's ALS? What are the plans? I mean, are you guys going to keep doing what you do best, or are there some interesting plans ahead?
No, I think what we've done, well, I think over the years is operate in or grow our business into new geographical locations where there's a need for our services, but centralise that back to our hub facilities where we have our knowledge base. And so, I think our focus there is really to be providing those services, being technical partners rather than just a service provider, and being able to find new and innovative ways to deliver that data. And I think the last few years our focus has been on detection limits in particular. I think we've still got we still have the lowest detection limits for 4-acid digestions on the market. We still have the lowest detection limits for other techniques as well. And the quality of the assay and the consistency of the assay has been the big focus for us. Because that allows our global partners to have projects in Europe or in South America and Australia, and they know that the method they get, they can benchmark them, or they can rank that data together and work with it, and be able to use that to when they find a particular system of whatever their algorithm tells them that there's a fertile or an infertile prospect, they can move that around the world and use that for same sort of projects. So I think that's that's our wheelhouse and our strength. In North America we've recently had the acquisition of the Gold Spot business, and so that would be interesting to see where that lands. They're maintaining as a separate consulting arm, and they don't access our geochem data. It's the clients have to authorise that. So to maintain that integrity and that separation. But there's a lot of AI and so forth that they have that I'm sure that they'll bring. Already bringing to the market.
And part of the reasoning to that. Skill base.
Absolutely. What else is out there that we can do as a group, and I think they bring a good mature skill set to the business in that regard. So I think and everyone of course is talking AI these days. So I think that's
if you're not part of it.
You're not part of it.
Relevant.
Exactly. Everyone's got a product. So I think it's those sorts of things, and then it comes down to if the sample's already with us, what else can we do with the sample that can add value to the assessment of it from a geological perspective? What's going to give the geologist more tools? And so that's certainly a focus of what else can we bring to the table, and that sort of we've seen that with things like doing ASD and doing PXRF as part of the the overall process, it's for a small incremental cost. You can get a whole bunch of additional data that can provide information that you could do yourself in the field. But if we've got a nice crush representative split of 1 meter to do a hyperspectral scan on, well, that's better than geologists love shiny rocks, as you know, and they always go and preferentially zap the shiny rocks. And so I don't know about these ones here, but that's right. So those sorts of things that we can take care of that. Those acquisitions of data, because it's already in our processes and it doesn't add time or cost to it. Those are the sorts of things that we've been doing well for years, and I'm sure we'll continue to do.
And any to close off, any myths that you would want to dispel, things that you would wish us dumb geologists would stop asking you, or that aren't real or true?
No, I think
the top three, I'm sure.
Yeah, the top three. No, look, I mean, for me, the key one I would say is it doesn't matter whether you're one of our clients or you're using another business, but get to know the process. I think get to understand what a laboratory does, what they actually bring to the table as far as analysis. Get to know that the analysis isn't just the rocks go in a chute and a little bit of data pops out the other end, so that you can have an appreciation for what that data means when you have to use it, but also you can have appreciation for when you're getting better overall service provision, a better overall quality, and you can make an assessment of that. Don't sort of get stuck on the fact that, it's just a number and my database is full of numbers and I've got a number for all my samples, so everything's right. Don't assume that quality is in place. Just because you've got an ISO 17025 doesn't mean you necessarily have good lab practices and you don't have good control and supervision and other processes. So get to know your lab.
And I was actually going to see if that would be a nice natural end to stop the conversation, but now you said something where I thought, because one thing I'm also intrigued by is the contract itself. Right?
Yes.
And quality is a fascinating word.
Oh yeah.
It's I still working as my quest to figure out what that means. How we get it. Precision, accuracy are also wonderful words, right? And then you need numbers, and then it becomes very difficult.
Yes.
So when you are a service provider and you provide quality to a product, and everything is about that word quality, there has to be a bunch of words that make sense to agree between you and the client what the objective is and when it is met.
Yes.
And I've seen a lot of these contracts with laboratories where it says, good quality, and I go, wow, that's fantastic.
Yes.
Getting off scot-free.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't do anything with it. Sorry, I might have ruined the whole interview.
You can spin it. No, that's exactly.
But why don't you, as an ALS, grab the bull by the horn and turn it around and actually provide those clauses that actually somehow have that quality conversation in a little bit more of a structured way? Or is it so difficult and opens up so many cans of worms that you just let clients do their thing?
I think there's a few things to unpack there. I think that the first one is that we do where we can. Unfortunately, some contracts are done by procurement people, and they're focusing on, well, what was the deliverable last time and why would we change that? And that's sometimes we have to just roll over and scratch our bellies in that regard. But I think there's sometimes you'll get a table of KPIs and say that no more than 0.5% of blanks will fail. And you go, well, okay.
What does fail mean?
Right. What does fail? And when we get a lot of those things, we will always push back and say, well, look, the method that we're quoting you here is capable of plus or minus 10% of two standard deviations, and we expect that our method blank will be less than 0.03. So if you want to build some fail rates and framework around that, we'd be comfortable with that. But if you just put in standards must 99.6% of standards must be between two standard deviations. Well, whose standard deviations and what are the control limits and who are we being held accountable to? Those things, what they end up being is they end up being there that if someone has a bone to pick, they can lean into, but they don't actually really address the quality. And so it's better to have an understanding of what the lab is capable of doing, because a mine site lab doing aqua reges as quickly as they can to get a result for face samples, their precision and accuracy is going to be different to a fire assay lab at a commercial facility in a place like Perth. So they all need different nuanced approaches to understand, well, what is quality, back to your original.
Well, and that's what, I mean, that's a little bit my quest, I guess, and to quantify that. I mean, you talk about precision, and again, I'd look at the that SGS guide, there's a little table in there that says for these things, we have these target precisions. The first thing that comes up and see, how do you calculate that?
Yes.
Because precision is this wonderful concept that nobody can seem to agree on. Right? I can do a whole bunch of variations of A minus B and then do a bunch of things with it and get a number out.
Yeah.
And so even then, what does it mean? And yeah, are you doing the same thing? It's bloody fascinating.
Yeah, well,
difficult to put in a clause, obviously.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and that's it. You know, as part of all of our method development, we have to do a method validation, and we establish uncertainties and precisions as part of that. And we have to be conservative in those limits because we don't deal with the same sample type all day, every day. So we have to have a level of wiggle room, I suppose, to be able to account for the fact that this sample was 15% copper and it was followed by a sample that was 0% copper. And so what are our limits on that? You know, and we over time know that the instrument will carry over X% between samples, or the pulverizer, an acceptable level is Y.
Yeah.
And so you need to be able to build your compliances and so forth around saying, well, if it exceeds this by X number of times, well, that's probably a gross failure that needs to be reviewed, as opposed to, well, you know, your limit is 0.5 and it was 0.6. Well, that's a failure. You're in breach of contract. No, that doesn't make sense.
Well, and you never know beforehand either, because you don't know what material you're dealing with.
Well,
how could you possibly put a precision value on something that you haven't really sampled yet?
Yeah.
And it becomes almost pointless.
Especially, you know, the number of times you put a hole in and you bring out rocks and you go, well, I wasn't expecting that to be there.
Well, that never happens.
No, that's right. And then they get to the lab and the lab's like, well, I haven't seen that before. And so if you've built it around what normally happens, that's fine. But normal doesn't always happen in the future.
Yeah. No, that's a nice.
You can have that one.
Yeah, we can have that one. Ben, thanks for coming in.
No worries, pleasure.
Fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate the
Cheers.
catch up. Cheers for that.